Everyone. Had a little technical difficulty there, and of course, Willis the hero helped me. Today we're going to talk about not just buyer agency. We're going to talk about being compensated for your buyer agency. And because that has shifted a bit with this new resolution to the NAR settlement, I'm going to bring that in as basically how do you get compensated under this new settlement thing. If this is new to you, or if you are new to the business, it is going to be a helpful guide. If you are pretty much a seasoned agent, this is going to be a review of what you know and probably what you already are capably doing. But I want to go through it just as a good reminder and a good introduction to newer agents. So now I might have a problem again. Pre-agency is that form that you use if you don't have buyer agency with the buyer. So you have to have at least this pre-agency agreement or a buyer agency agreement. And I think some agents are forgetting about this. If you're not ready to sit down and go through all the education and benefits of buyer agency, go see the house with the pre-agency form, and then have a time to talk to the buyer. But prior to any showing, as you know, since August 27th, we have to have one or the other. We have to have a pre-agency form or a buyer agency form. And I really kind of get nervous about signing up a buyer agency form with a buyer if this buyer is new to you, if this buyer really doesn't understand buyer agency, especially if this buyer is from another state. You really need the time to talk about it, have a buyer agency consultation before you get them to sign it. So that's critical and that's important. So when you're talking about this discussion with a buyer and the benefits of having buyer agency, you have to, in this buyer consultation, talk about all the benefits that you get if you work with me as a buyer's agent. I'm going to be representing you. I'm going to be negotiating for you. I'm going to go above and beyond the normal services that I would do with a customer and help you get the best price for the best property. So it is critically important to have a buyer consultation these days, especially with the changes. Some buyers may not know of anything about these changes. Some may have read up on it and are pretty educated, but have a lot of questions. There's a whole public attitude here, well, maybe we don't have to pay real estate agents anymore. And so it's your responsibility to explain and educate this, why your value must be compensated. Actually, it's against your license law to do real estate services for free. You must be compensated. You can get compensation from the listing agent's firm, from the seller, or from the buyer if you have buyer agency, or a combination of these sources to meet the compensation listed. So if they're only offering, seller's only offering 2%, you can get compensation from the seller for 0.4%. So you can use a combination of your buyer agency and what the listing agent is, what the seller is willing to give. So what you have to do is show what your services include as a buyer agent. Don't just take it for granted. I've made up a list, but you can make up your own lists as well. This is the list that I have. I don't think it's fully, no, it's not fully showing on this. But some of the ideas, these are services that you can offer to both a customer and to a client, like arrange showings, assist with financing, provide property data, explain forms and agreements, monitor the closing, prepare a property value, and of course, have confidentiality. But then it gets to the list of things that you only would do as a buyer's agent. So you provide access to the entire market. That means what's listed and for sale by owners. If you do have that in the agreement, you can write letters to owners who may be interested in selling. Say your buyer is interested in a certain block, you can send a letter to all the homes in that block and say, I have a buyer who really likes this area. Would you have any interest in considering selling? Promote and protect the buyer's best interests. Advise the buyer in terms of the offer. You can't do that if you're working with a customer, only with your client. This is, I think, the most important benefit of having a buyer agent. That buyer's agent is going to negotiate for the buyer, get the best price and terms, have strategies. You're going to negotiate directly with the listing agent and representing your buyer. You can point out reasons not to buy. Can't do that with a customer. Explain the pros and cons of an appraisal contingency, right to cure, title issues, testing, financing contingencies, addendum AC. All of these things can be, need to be better explained and use why you should use them or why you shouldn't use them. Using the addendum O for occupancy or R for rental properties to clarify your offer to purchase. Making sure that you're bringing in all the documents and all of the contracts that we have at our disposal that help assist you and your buyer. Check with the municipality on current issues or issues with property. It's your responsibility as a buyer's agent to go down to City Hall or whatever municipality you're in and look up the property. Talk to the tax assessor or get information from the municipality on the tax assessment on this property. See if there are any easements or things like that. That's your responsibility as a buyer's agent. You're going above and beyond what you would do with a customer. But for both customer and client, you would follow through on all the terms and dates, of course, and keep buyer's position confidential, cut for customers and for clients. That is a benefit of the state of Wisconsin. We keep all parties confidential. But as I said, it's really important, especially in these days, to have a buyer consultation first. If you're going to rush off and show a house, use the pre-agency form, but take time to really prepare a good buyer consultation. It helps you build your relationship with this buyer. It helps you know what that buyer's motives are and their timeline. Talk about why you have a good negotiating position as their agent. You will negotiate directly with the listing agent. If they were a customer, they would be coming up with their own price and terms. Explain that your services go above and beyond the customer relationship. Discuss the new requirements and make sure that you know how to explain this new settlement. Show how the Wisconsin agents have been ahead of this game, understanding buyer agency, having a buyer agency agreement. Many states don't even bring it up. They don't have an agreement in writing. So they really have to go through a lot more changes than we do as agents in the state of Wisconsin. But it's all about being transparent. It's negotiable. It's talking about value. It's talking about how good you are, how informed you are, how well can you educate and guide a buyer. So this, I'm gonna move this up. Sorry. So buyer's agents should discuss the amount of commission to be paid by the buyer to the buyer's firm. It's a section in the buyer agency form. We have sort of glided over it in the past. Oh yes, you will have to pay me if the seller doesn't pay me or whatever. Or if you're doing a for sale by owner and the for sale by owner won't pay an agent, you may have to pay me then. But we would kind of skirt over that. Now it's much more important. The buyer's agents have to be fully aware and educated that by signing this buyer agency agreement, that the amount of compensation that you get as a buyer's agent is negotiable. You have to negotiate with your buyer. You have to make sure that the buyer is responsible for paying the buyer agency fee, and the amount owed by the buyer may be reduced or eliminated by what the listing firm is offering. So if the listing firm is offering 2% and your buyer agency agreement says 2.4, your buyer should be aware that he is responsible for paying that difference of the 0.4. Or you can further negotiate with the seller to see if they would raise it up. But that is more serious now. Before, we've kind of brushed it off. Now it is something that we have to attune to. And the buyer has to be fully understanding this part of the buyer agency agreement before they sign it. So that's why it's not a good idea to have this rushed, oh, quickly sign this. This just means I'll work for you, da, da, da. And it gets to a point where the buyer has to pony up for some of your commission. And they go, wait a minute, I didn't know about this. This is something that you are responsible for, to make the buyer fully understand what he is responsible for. Oh, yeah. So any questions regarding this? Because I think this is the key to what is new and what is different, and what is getting you paid as a buyer agent. If you're working with a customer, there is no guarantee, because that customer doesn't have to pay you anything. They're not signing any kind of an agreement that they have to make up the difference or pay you any kind of compensation. So you can only get compensation if you're working with a customer from the seller or the buyer agent's firm. Hopefully the seller is willing to work with, willing to compensate the buyer's agent. He's smart if he does. And the listing firm has put out a compensation agreement that says that the listing firm will be paying the buyer agent firm the commission, fully commission. We all want to work toward what we have been working for, but don't ever say that this is standard, or 2.4 is what everybody does, or 2.4 is what our broker wants us to do. We do have a minimum with our broker, but it isn't anything that you would use in your argument with the buyer, So any questions on this? Because I think this is the new key to being compensated under buyer agency. Rebecca says, are we allowed to say that we don't work with buyer customers because of the compensation? I wouldn't say that unilaterally, because there are times that you may have to work with the buyer customer. Say if it's if there's a conflict with the buyer working with them as a client. A lot of times investors will not work as a buyer's agent, will not work in buyer agency. They like to dance around and like to work with customers. But I wouldn't say that unilaterally, because you may have to work with the buyer customer. Good question, though. Anybody else have a question? I'm so stuck here.
What word would you use when you're saying like 2.4? You don't want to say the norm. 2.4 is most common. 2.4, what, when you're using that number, what word would you use?
Yeah, as I said, I wouldn't use the word standard, and this is where you, but you can say most common compensation for a buyer's agent has been 2.4. You are saying in your buyer agency agreement that you are wanting 2.4. And I think it's just as long as you don't say that it is, you know, it's required, obviously, or it's something that we need to do. Because you want to keep the attitude that it's always negotiable. I can't get rid of this. So how does it work then if we are potentially getting paid with the new changes? If a buyer customer wants to put an offer on a property that is not offering compensation, the only way you can do that is to put it obviously in the offer to purchase line 543 or whatever. That part of your offer is that the seller pays the buyer 2.4%. You put it in there. So it becomes a term in your offer. So if they're not offering a compensation agreement, then you have to put it in the offer. There. So that your question is good because it gets me to this next slide. This is where Steph and I probably have the most calls, the most questions about compensation agreement versus line 43 in the offer. And I put it in quotes because it's obviously not line 543 in the condo offer or vacant land offer. But in the residential offer to purchase, it's line 43. It's on the last page. And it just says that it is an agreement in the offer to purchase between buyer and seller, because that's what the offer is. An offer is an agreement between buyer and seller where they're talking to one another. So if you're putting it in the offer, your buyer is saying, seller to compensate on behalf of me, the buyer, seller to compensate my buyer's agent a certain amount, 2.4. We'll just use that. So in order for this contract to be fulfilled. So it becomes part of the terms of the offer that your buyer is saying, I'm going to buy this house, but I am asking you, the seller, on behalf of me, on behalf of to pay my buyer's agent. And so if you're not getting a compensation agreement, oh, wait, I made a mistake. Sorry. If you're not getting a compensation agreement and you have a customer, take back everything I just said, you cannot put it in line 543 because that's only when you have buyer agency agreement. So line 543 only pertains to a buyer agent and the buyer. If the buyer is a customer, then you cannot ask for seller to compensate your customer. So a lot of times you could be pretty much up to it. You could go back and draft your own compensation agreement because that's a firm to firm agreement. It's not a buyer to seller agreement. And you could go back and fill out your part of a compensation agreement, send it to the listing agent, and see if the firms will agree to compensate you. But the most important thing, and I'm sorry I made that mistake, it's a glitch. But the most important thing for you to remember is only one of these can be offered. You can't get a compensation agreement from a listing agent and then also put it in your offer that you want this compensation. If that is done, you have to remove one of these things. You have to counter out or amend out the line 543 in the offer, or you have to reject the compensation form. So any questions on that? Because seriously, this is where we're getting all of our questions. What happens if sometimes it's another agent from another firm that they haven't had as much training as we have. But it is the most common agreement and excuse me, most common question that we're getting. But basically it comes down to, what do I do if, and it's already done, a compensation agreement and it's in the offer to purchase. Any question on that? Okay, so let's get to the compensation agreement. It is something that's new. It's part of the brand new documents with this new settlement. And it is an agreement between the seller's firm and the buyer's firm, as opposed to the seller and the buyer. So this is a firm-to-firm agreement saying that the seller's firm will compensate the buyer's firm whatever, 2%, 2.4%, 3%, whatever. And then that is to be signed by the buyer's agent when they get it. Hopefully that you get that compensation agreement prior to you writing the offer. So you know before you write the offer that you're going to be compensated. If it's not available, then you ask for it from the listing agent. None of this will be in MLS. The document compensation agreement will not be in MLS. There will be no hints to what the compensation is anywhere in MLS. It won't be in showing time or any other form relating from MLS. They're going to totally ignore the whole compensation part. And at KW, we have said that the agent can sign this agreement, this compensation agreement. When we talk to WRA and when we talk to our lawyers, they say that it's open. Either a broker has to sign it or an agent can be designated to sign them. And Keller Williams have decided to let you agents sign that compensation agreement. So you're representing the firm by saying, yes, we will accept this compensation agreement, and it becomes part of the package. Compensation agreement is not to be attached to the offer. It is to be sent back with the agent's signature, but it is not to be attached. If the seller has not made available a compensation agreement, either online or through a phone call, getting it sent to you before you write the offer, the buyer can ask for compensation in the offer to purchase. Or the buyer can ask the listing agent, can you send me a compensation agreement? If the listing agent says no, the seller didn't understand that or didn't want to fill that out, then that's when you can ask for it in the offer to purchase on line 543, whatever. And that's where you put in that on behalf of the buyer, the seller is compensating the buyer's agent. And again, repeating my correction, it can only be used for a buyer's agent. If the seller does not agree to that term in the offer, buyer to compensate the buyer's agent firm or any portion to match the amount of the buyer agency agreement. Buyer's agent cannot agree to an amount more than the amount in the buyer agency agreement. That was a pretty important part in the settlement requirements that say the buyer's willing to offer 3% compensation to the buyer's agent. And in your buyer agency agreement, you only have 2.4. You cannot accept the 3%. You have to counter that or amend that. Or you can amend your buyer agency agreement and change the 2.4 to 3. So you could do either one, but they do have to match the buyer agency agreement compensation. But the bottom line is, if the seller doesn't agree to what's in the offer or does not offer a compensation agreement, the buyer is to compensate the buyer agent firm. So this is where the buyer pays either the 2.4% that's in the buyer agency agreement or whatever's in the buyer agency agreement. Maybe it's 2%, but the buyer is to compensate the buyer agent firm. Or, as I said, any portion to match the amount. So maybe the seller is offering 2%, then the buyer has to come up with 0.4%. This is the key. This is the important part. When you got this, you got it all. Any questions? Oh, you're also smart. I think that's it. Yeah. So as I said, this is just a reminder, a review. It's a basic for agents that are new and haven't started writing offers or started listing agreements. But this is the side of the buyer's agent and the buyer or the customer and the agent. But these are things that you have to be clear in your mind, that you can understand and that you can educate your buyer to this change. It's something that comes in the buyer consultation. I've always, from day one, been a fan and advocate for the buyer agent just the buyer's consultation. Go through the whole process. You go through what the costs are going to be. You go through what inspection contingency is going to look like. You go through what the financing contingency looks like. You talk about what happens if. You talk about the questions that most commonly come up in the middle of a transaction. There are a lot of stages to the transaction. A lot of agents have very, very good pre-set up buyer consultation presentations. They're excellent. Look at some samples. A lot of people are sharing them. Go to the library, look up buyer consultation presentations. Make up your own, but start with looking at other agents who are willing to share. Go to any of the trainings when they're talking about buyer consultation, because this is where you erase, hopefully, all the surprises that come up in a transaction. And if you've been in real estate more than, I would say, a year, you understand that things come up in a transaction. They always do. Don't ever say, oh, this is an easy one, because you're sure to find out the next day that problem comes up. So let's see what you got here. Guess I'm still a little confused about the buyer, customer, and compensation. Well, it's basically, if you're working with somebody as a buyer, they are not a client. They are not obligated to pay you anything. You are also not obligated to give them extra services, like a lot in that list that I read. You are basically just there to fill in the offer to purchase based on what they want. Tell me what price you want to put down. Tell me what earnest money you want to put down. Tell me what you want to do here. That's all you're doing. You're not suggesting, you're not giving advice, you're not giving best practices, you're not going out of your way, you're not going to a municipality to check on the property. So really, that customer is not obligated to pay you anything. A client is obligated to pay you when they sign that buyer agency agreement. So what other questions or confusion do you have about that? I'm willing to clarify.
I guess I'm just a little confused then. If we're not sending buyer agency, buyer
Mhm.
customer has no obligation to pay us. And then if the seller's not offering compensation, how are we getting paid? Because we technically can't work for free and no one
Right,
wants to work for free.
right.
So are people really not going to be doing, you said for investors, they like, being customers. I guess
Mhm.
I'm just a little confused. I'm a new agent too. So,
Well, it's basically your choice. I mean, if you see ahead of time that you're not gonna get paid, the customer is not gonna pay you, and you can tell that, he doesn't like that idea. And if he's interested in a property where the seller absolutely refuses to compensate any agent, and there's no backup for your client to pay you, you're not going to get paid, and you can make the choice that I'm not going to do this, or let's find another property where they will pay me, or try to get them to be a buyer's client. But if in the buyer consultation, you have explained the value of what buyer agency is and how it is levels above what services they get as a buyer customer. I mean, you can say, I really haven't done that much, um, maybe to even get you to pay for it, because I'm not really doing much at all. And that's where it does conflict with the license law that says you can't do any work for free. You can negotiate in the new normal conversation this morning. Sarah Jo had a really good suggestion where she uses terms in the offer that actually would benefit the buyer, would save the buyer some money, so the buyer would see your value. So, as a buyer's agent, if you can show what your value is and what you're doing. But I would say going forward, especially in this world, try to get buyer agency with all of your buyers. If there's some that won't do it, maybe then you don't want to work with them as a buyer.
I think it's important to note too that with investors, you can do a buyer agency for just that specific property too, so that just for her understanding. So if they don't want to do a long term, they can do for just a specific property.
Yes, and that's a very good idea, that they can sign a buyer agency just for that property that they want to put an offer in. With the understanding that if the seller's not going to compensate you, nor is the listing firm compensating you, that they will compensate you. And break it down. They also said this in the new normal this morning. Break it down into figures. Sometimes that amount of 2.4 is like maybe $2,200. It's not something that could destroy it. And if they really want this, then I'll be your buyer's agent just for this property. And if nobody will pay me, then you are responsible for paying me. And let's look at what that figure is. If we settle on this price, this is what 2.4 of that is we're talking about. Or you can ask for seller concessions. That's another thing. That instead of paying the compensation, get some concessions for the buyer so that the buyer can afford to pay you. Those are best practices that are going to be coming up as more and more people find these situations where they have to work on it. And they have to come up with some strategies, and it's transactional. It's transaction by transaction. But excellent idea. Get a buyer agency agreement just for that property. Anything else? Well, I hope I explained some things for you, or I hope I verified a lot of questions that you might have. But please call Steph or me when you do have questions about something in a particular transaction. Something that you need to know or you feel stuck. So we're always happy to help. Another thing is those new normal conversations at 8:30 in the morning are going to continue for a little while. I strongly suggest tuning in on those. We've all learned so many good pointers from that, and there will be more and more good pointers. So next Monday, I'm going to go through the inspection contingency, which is what we had sort of previously planned for today, but we felt this was more timely. So next week at Monday at noon to 1, we're going to talk thoroughly about the inspection contingency, what to expect, what to prepare your clients for, either the seller or the buyer, and then negotiating the inspection contingency results. So I hope you're on next Monday. And other than that, go out and enjoy this beautiful day.